Thank you for having me again to join you to talk about East Milton Square. Appreciate you all taking the time to come out, both in the room and online. So thank you, Meredith and Planning Board, for hosting us this evening. So let me get started here. So this is, as you all know, I think a Planning Board study. This is really the culmination of years of effort, which I'll go through in detail, but would just like to thank the Planning Board's members' dedication to this process and the hours that you all spent discussing and guiding this work, and also Cheyenne and Julia, who've been a part of the team supporting this effort. I'm from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC, and have had a team of colleagues who have been supporting me on this effort as well, but I'm here representing that group this evening. If you don't know about MAPC, we are the regional planning agency for the greater Boston area. We serve 101 cities and towns through planning assistance such as this work, and are happy to have provided these types of assistance to Milton a lot over the years. So I'm happy to be a part of your planning efforts in the town. So we have a pretty straightforward agenda this evening, and we'll have some time for any clarifying questions or comments you would all like to make as well. I'd like to provide a background and recap about this process and where we've been and what we've come to get what we've gone through to get to this point of having draft zoning, which is on the town meeting warrant. We'll go through in detail a summary of that zoning, just so everyone has the opportunity to see that presented and get a feel for the details of it. We also have a companion to the zoning, which is a proposed design guidelines, which the Planning Board would adopt to supplement the regulations in the bylaw. And then can have discussion. I think we'll see how it goes, but feel free also if there's clarifying questions as I go along to ask, but we might, depending on the number and volume of those, maybe ask you to hold those towards the end, but we'll see how it goes. And then we'll have some good time for questions and comments, and then just some very brief next steps to let you know what's coming up in the next couple months. So you all know East Milton very well, and East Milton Square particularly. This work is focused on that geography within the town. It's a very important place, both within your lives and within the broader context of the town of Milton. East Milton, of course, and East Milton Square are vibrant places. They are places that have had substantial and historical investment over the years. It's a place that many of you identify very closely with as home, as a center of business, as a place of substantial commerce and activity in the town. And this is something that we hope to support through the process that we've been engaged in and through the proposed zoning to help make future investments consistent with that history and legacy and identity of East Milton Square, and strengthen it as those investments come forward. So really the focus of our effort, and this is again has been the culmination of years of effort. We're building on many others in planning work who have come before us, but this has really been a concentrated effort to define zoning regulations, to define design guidelines which will complement those regulations, and then hopefully to usher those recommendations to adoption at town meeting. That's really the place where zoning recommendations have to go ultimately. So this type of forum this evening is very important for you all to get a sense and understanding of the details, so hopefully you can feel comfortable voicing your support for this zoning. And this is all to proactively guide future investments in East Milton Square. Very simply, this evening, again, we're going through a summary of that zoning and then discussing your questions and comments. So background and recap on how we've gotten here this evening. These are the substantial studies that I mentioned, dating all the way back to, I'd like to focus on the Milton Master Plan in 2015, really set the stage for the subsequent studies to occur. The Milton Master Plan really focused on East Milton Square as a center of activity, a center of identity and commerce in the town, center of economic development, and important to the residents of East Milton and also important to the residents of the town at large. The master plan recommended that there be some follow-on planning studies in more detail that the master plan couldn't get into, and that those planning studies would look at zoning specifically. So that is really, you can imagine all of the following studies and then our work and the culminating zoning recommendations as implementation of the town-wide master plan. To give further direction to that more detailed planning work, there was a follow-on short concentrated study hosted by the Urban Land Institute, who comes into a community and provides design charrettes of a sort, and they did that in East Milton Square, and provided recommendations really primarily around building consensus in the community, all of you coming together, voicing your opinions over the years through these studies, and hopefully seeing those reflected back to you in the recommendations that we have this evening. And then the looking forward study was really, I would say in many ways, that detailed planning foundation for the work that we've done with the zoning. There were zoning recommendations in that work which were interrogated as a part of our process and through conversations with the community. And our recommendations where the final zoning ended up are, I would say, a little bit different than where the planning recommendations from that looking forward study were, and there are reasons for it. Primarily the reasons for it are because of your input and guidance as a community in East Milton. So that series of follow-on meetings that were part of our process, developing the zoning recommendations, we performed stakeholder interviews as we first got started in that effort. We had hosted community meetings in this space, two of which I think I see many familiar faces. A lot of you were a part of that. We hosted, in conjunction with those community meetings, community surveys, which provided the opportunity for others not available in the meeting time to provide feedback and input on the substance of the zoning. And then throughout all of that, you can see a series of dates where we've engaged with the planning board, and they've been guiding the conversation and efforts as well, and had very detailed conversations with them throughout this process. So of course, East Milton Square is not without zoning today. It has a zoning has a zoning district. It is within the business district. You can see in the red here on the zoning map, highlighted with that dashed yellow circle. And that zoning has, I think, proven recently to not provide a viable pathway for future development to come forward. So you'll see what's been happening in recent years is people who have a development proposal avoiding the current zoning through mechanisms such as 40B. So the current business district zoning is focused on commercial development. It allows business uses up to 3 stories in height or up to 5 stories by special permit. And it is, that scale of office building in the context of East Milton Square is just something that the real estate market is not producing. So it's an asset type, a real estate type, which just isn't, that the zoning currently allows, but that isn't coming forward as an opportunity. What we've heard through all of that engagement, and this is at a high level and generalized, we've gotten into a lot of detail in the surveys, and thank you all for taking the time to participate in those. But we heard a lot of concern around building height specifically and the scale of future development as really the primary concern and controversial item. And getting that building height right has been a sort of a very strong feature of many of the conversations that we've had. We've also heard a fair amount of concern around parking and traffic in the square, and then also potential impacts or benefits to the surrounding neighborhood, and making sure that those are tied closely to development investments. And then really a lot of conversations that highlighted the importance of the character and the existing context of East Milton Square, and the need for and desire for high quality design in future investments. So we'll now just shift gears a little bit and walk you through the summary of the proposed zoning. And hopefully, if you have not been following along and how it's evolved, you'll see reflected back to you, I think, a lot of the concerns and comments that we've heard throughout this process. And hopefully that's the result we hear in the comments and questions later. All of the items which I'm presenting this evening in presentation format are also available on the town's website through the planning board's documents, and you can grab the links. The links are available on the screen. You can also browse to them pretty easily, but they have been there for some time now, a few months, and each of the documents, the zoning bylaw language, which is, we'll be going through pieces of it, but its full language is there. There's a commentary memo which we prepared, which provides more layman term descriptions of the various sections of the zoning and sort of reason behind the language that's been developed. And then there's also the design guidelines document, which is a companion to the zoning. So those 3 items are available on the town's website. So the proposed zoning, in summary, really that first bullet point is the main headline take-home message, that we are trying to shift from a commercial development-oriented zoning, which is the existing zoning, to a mixed-use zoning, which would include residential and business uses. And that would be permitted through site plan review with the planning board. And that would be up to a scale of 3 stories or 45 feet, and then subject to a series of conditions which are built into the zoning language. I'll talk about the boundary in a second, but just wanted to dwell a moment on that main takeaway message, that we're shifting from allowing commercial only at 3 stories or up to 5 stories by special permit to allowing residential to be a part of that commercial mix. And we'll get into the details, but the primary idea of that mixing is that the commercial uses would occur on the ground floor, and there's language in the zoning about that. The residential uses would occur on the upper floors, and at least in the current iteration of the real estate market, I would say over maybe even the past few previous iterations, that is a real estate development typology which is viable financially, it's marketable, it's something that can be potentially built. I think it provides an opportunity which doesn't presently exist in East Milton Square. So it's potentially going to at least give anyone who has a development interest in a property in East Milton Square the opportunity to have to explore a viable project through the zoning regulations, which today they look at the zoning regulations and they say there's really nothing there for me, so I'm going to shift to some other avenue. So that's what we're trying to open up here, is that viable opportunity. The boundary I'll talk about next. It's important to think about the geography as we go through the details of the zoning. So this is the zoning diagram which we've been using. It's a little complicated, but the red tones are basically those parcels which are currently in the commercial district. If it's a lighter red tone, it's actually a split parcel, so it's a parcel which is partially in the commercial district and partially in the residential district. The purple tones on the west side of the expressway are not presently in the commercial district. So that black boundary is what we're suggesting would be the boundary for this proposed overlay district. And I have another diagram which shows it directly on top of the current zoning map, which might be a little easier for people to see and understand. I'll just dwell on this for a moment, make the point about an overlay district. So what we're talking about this evening is an overlay district. It's an optional zoning district. The underlying zoning remains in effect. So if someone did want to develop a commercial property under the current regulations, they would be able to do so. The current regulations stay. All the rights that property owners have with those regulations are not impacted in any way. By providing an overlay district, we're providing a new opportunity on top of the opportunities that already exist within this geography. And that geography is a little bit different than the existing geography of the business zone. Not by too much. So you see here, this is a snapshot enlarged of the existing zoning map of the town, so I have not done anything to it. You can see the blue outline with the red center is the existing boundary of the business district. This is that same black boundary that was on the previous slide I presented of the new overlay. And any of the parcels, so you see, I think the fruit center is a good example. Maybe you can all see if you see, there's my cursor. So this parcel here is the fruit center. And that's a good example of the discrepancy here, is that the front portion of the fruit center is in the business district. The back portion of the fruit center is in the residential district. For the overlay district, we're trying to clarify that circumstance. There's language in the existing zoning that deals with split parcels. I've always been an advocate that it's much easier to just show parcels either in or outside of a zoning boundary with the zoning map. So this zoning map makes that clarification. So that's what you see. Some of the differences are really just following the parcel lines, and that's what you see as you move further down Granite Avenue on the southern portion of the district as well. That's just a squaring off of the parcels, instead of having the business district as it exists today as a straight line that doesn't respect parcel boundaries. So that's the differences really on the east side of the expressway. On the west side of the expressway, there are, I think it's 4 parcels that are being included that are commercial parcels today. The uses on the properties are commercial parcels. And we're bringing them into this overlay to be consistent with their current uses. So that's what you see is the addition. Let me get my cursor back. The addition here and here. Those are commercial parcels, a bank, physical therapist, I think it is, and some other small businesses. Those are what you see are the main differences on this side. I think the biggest difference here is the fruit center on that side, and then some of these discrepancies here. So in large part following the existing business district with some of those minor differences. And that's what would be, that's where the proposed overlay would apply within those parcels, and that's where these new opportunities would be present. If, I think this is a great starting point for the town. If this district in future years yields the types of results that the community would like to see and the town would like to see, then of course this overlay district could be expanded however the town would like to see that happen. But I think this is a good starting point that makes some minor adjustments, but that is basically following the current business district. So here is the section outline for the mixed-use overlay district language. This is how the order of the sections as prepared in the bylaw language. It starts with the purpose, outlines, and this is a similar construction for all of the special sections in Milton's bylaw. So as follows, for example, the outline of the Milton Village language as well. So purpose defines allowable uses that are allowed in the district, dimensional requirements that apply to properties within this overlay, a section about historic preservation, which we've heard that key character and identity is so important to the community. Another section about design standards, again, getting at that character of the development. A very short section about sign approval, which refers to the other sections of the bylaw. Affordable housing requirements, parking requirements, and then information about the application processes in I, J, and K. So I'll walk through those in detail just so you can see what is in the language, but all of this is basically putting together a package, again, that would allow mixed-use development while putting guardrails around that mixed-use development, not more than 3 stories in height, that can be responsive to the desires that we've heard from the community about the types of things you'd like to see in future development. And that starts with the purpose statement. So this is, I think, captures a lot of what we've heard in the discussions. And so this is the purpose of this overlay district is to allow high-quality mixed-use development that enhances East Milton Square. And then it goes on to suggest that successful mixed-use development shall do a few things. And that includes strengthening walkability and safe circulation for all travel in East Milton Square, however you're getting around, walking, biking, riding in a car. Proactively and intentionally guiding commercial district investment, which the current zoning is not doing, just as a reminder. Enhancing the sense of place and district identity, and we're doing that through a number of ways, through the design standards, which we'll go through later, and through the design guidelines, which are the companion document. Leveraging private investments to add community amenities while reducing impacts. Again, there's language in the standards and guidelines which are pointing to the types of investments and amenities the community would like to see, while also making sure that concerns such as traffic and parking are addressed as well. Encouraging mixed-use development and an increased variety of housing options. That's something that we, not just in Milton, but in all towns that we're dealing with around the region, are dealing with a lack of housing diversity in terms of the options for people to live. We're predominantly still single-family homes, and it's good to, this is a great place to enhance that opportunity for a diversity of housing options in a walkable place. Improving environmental sustainability and resilience in the district, and we have language about that in the standards and guidelines. And then lastly, preserving and enhancing the historic character of East Milton. So all of those are key components that we've heard. Those are directly in the language of the zoning bylaw, and there's no confusion. That's the first section. The allowable uses really focus on and add a little more detail to what is at that high level summary, that mixed use is the focus here. Mixed use development, both with non-residential and residential uses. The non-residential uses refer to the current business uses allowed in the district. So any of those same uses are allowed in this district, with a few exceptions. And what we're trying to do is continue East Milton Square's evolution toward a more walkable, less auto-oriented place. It's got those bones, and we're trying to reinforce that. So we've made exceptions to not add additional drive-through food service facilities, filling stations, garages, sales rooms or repair shops for motor vehicles, storage warehouses, or undertakers. So those are future uses. The existing uses that already exist, this doesn't impact them. We're creating new opportunities. So we're saying we don't want more of those in East Milton Square with these types of investments. So we've carved those out of the existing commercial uses which are allowed. And then residential uses are allowed in combination with those non-residential uses. To be clear about the type of development that we are expecting and requiring, that section D is very important. So ground floor uses, we're requiring at least 50% of the usable ground floor area of the building to be occupied by a non-residential use. So that's important because we're not trying to open the door for residential only projects to occur as a development feature of this zoning. We want mixed use development, and we want the ground floor to be active and vibrant and contributing to the square. So that's an important aspect of the allowable uses. The dimensional requirements are pretty straightforward, and I think are both trying to set the context, the historical urban design context of East Milton Square, which is a more traditional layout of the buildings, which is towards the back of the sidewalk, defining the street edge, reinforcing a walkable place. We're trying to reinforce that while also providing some flexibility. So the front yard setback is actually a range, so we would anticipate buildings being developed anywhere from 0 feet off the lot line, which would be at the back of the sidewalk, to maybe 10 feet in from the lot line, which would provide a more generous sidewalk space or a front plaza. That's the range. Buildings have to land within that range on the front. On the side yard, we tried to be flexible. There's a existing context of buildings having a 0 side yard setback where they're actually sharing a party wall. We want to allow that in the future if occurring, commercial property adjacent to commercial property, and maximize that disposition of a building on the site. If a property is adjacent to a residential only use, we established that there should be a 10-foot setback to that adjacent property use. So there's variation there depending on the context. And then have a similar setup for rear yard setbacks, that if you have a rear yard that abuts an existing mixed use or business use, it's a little smaller setback in the rear at 12 feet. And if it's a residential use, it's a 20-foot setback. So trying to work within the context of the properties of the district, which are smaller properties. So we're trying to keep these setbacks on the tighter side, but we think that this offers the flexibility and the responsiveness to the context of an individual property. Building height is very straightforward. I don't think there's any room for confusion here. Maximum height is 3 stories, 45 feet in height, and that's very clear. There's no exceptions to that. There's no additional conditions. I know in the process we talked about potential things like an incentive for a larger height. None of that is included. It's just straight 3 stories, 45 feet. The ground story height we have described as, again, trying to reinforce the vibrancy and vitality of the district. We want a certain height on that ground floor, so we put in a minimum of 12 feet, which will hopefully match both the historic character and context of those storefronts, but also provide generous storefronts in the future development. And that's occurring on those primary streets which are adding to the vitality of the district. So Adams Street, Granite Ave, Bryant Ave, and Bassett Street. Open space, there's a minimum requirement of 10%, which can be fulfilled in a variety of ways, and that again would be adding amenity to the district, amenities that are desired. additional pedestrian plazas, extension of sidewalk or public realm, additional pocket parks, roof decks, balconies, etc. So historic preservation and the preservation of the character of the district, we've heard, is critically important throughout the process. We established a sort of benchmarking date, looking at the context of those important historic structures that are adding to the character of the district. Most of them, well, all of them actually, exist with a building date prior to 1940. So we've set that as a critical date for additional review and requirements that get triggered by that date. So if in the assessor's data, which is clearly available for all properties in the district and in the overlay, if you have a property which is pre-1940, then you have to go through some additional steps and requirements. Post-1940, you would be exempt from those additional requirements. But this is kind of a divergent path so that we make sure historic preservation is really accounted for in the district. That additional review includes the Historical Commission in addition to the Planning Board, and then provides additional guidance around what should be done with that property. It's not to say that a part of the thinking is actually increasing the options for historical properties so that they have an avenue for investment and revitalization as well, but not to just let that be a free ride, but to make sure that it's done in a way that's compatible with the existing structure and that respects the history of that structure. So this is a lot of language, and I had a hard time cutting it down for a slide. This is very similar to what's in the language of the zoning bylaw. But I wanted to illustrate the type of language that's in the design standards, in the zoning bylaw itself, to help protect the desires of the community. So this is language that includes enhancing the livability for surrounding residents. Those are words that we heard from many of you. Defining the street frontage by occupying street edges. Those are things I just described with the setbacks as well. Creating an active ground floor and filling gaps between existing buildings. Shaping outdoor spaces with the placement of buildings. Making sure that active ground floor uses also have transparent ground floor facades so that we're relating to the sidewalk in important ways. Defining street edges, corners of intersections. Consolidating and sharing off-street parking efficiently, improving streetscapes and walkability by minimizing curb cuts for automobiles to parking lots, for example, and enhancing livability through the creation of pocket parks, additional outdoor spaces, or new outdoor amenities, and being visually attractive and compatible with the context. So there's a little bit more in the zoning bylaw itself, but these, I think, provide the framework for basically giving the planning board tools when an applicant comes forward with a proposal to say, you know, how did you meet this, how did you meet that? And we're actually requiring the applicant to provide a narrative of how they actually have integrated these elements into their proposal as well. So that sets the stage for design standards. And then we actually have additional language for each of these items within the zoning bylaw itself, which are design standards, which must be met. They are standards, they are requirements of a project. So that it includes being context sensitive, expanding the public realm, providing more generous sidewalks, more generous plazas, more generous places for outdoor dining, for example. Respecting the historical character, heritage, and legacy of East Milton Square. Being context sensitive within the height and scale. So even though we have a 3-story maximum, that might invite doing creative things with the form of the building to respond to other structures around it, which might be of a lower height, for example. Being context sensitive with the width and scale, so it's not just massive buildings that are occurring, but buildings that are broken down to the scale and character of the historic district. Highlighting the active ground floor, again, adjacent to active sidewalks. Windows and doors as design features, so moving a little bit into the architectural character that we'd like to see. It being attractive from all sides, knowing that this business district sits within the context of a larger residential area, and people will have views into those properties from all sorts of angles. Integrating and concealing mechanical equipment, reducing the visual impact of parking, reducing the impact of vehicular access, and then integrating site light, landscape lighting and signs. So each of these have a sentence or two about them in the zoning bylaw language that provide again, the mechanism in that review for the planning board to say, like, where is this in the project? How did you respond to that? And this is, even though we are proposing this zoning as site plan review, so there's the ability to condition a project but not reject a good project. These design standards provide within that site plan review very concrete and tangible requirements that must be met, and if they are not met, that is grounds for negating the approval of a site plan review. We also, in the spirit of diversifying the housing stock in the town, included a requirement for affordable housing units. So if a project is less than 25 units, that's 12%. If it's more than 25 units, that moves up to 15%. And that affordability would be benchmarked at 80% of the area median income. That's similar to a requirement that's in Milton Village as well. So I think that is a good practice for the town to have integrated into these zoning opportunities so that you can keep pace with the affordability requirements and not always be losing ground on the 10% requirement of Chapter 40B. All affordable units are to be integrated and distributed and comparable with the market rate units, and to the maximum extent feasible, preference shall be given to Milton residents and employees for those affordable units. In terms of parking, we maintain for the business uses the minimum requirements that are in the current zoning. So those port across to the overlay district. The planning board has the option, again within the review process, to increase or decrease the number of business parking spaces required based upon the context of the applicant's situation, the types of uses that are being used. For the residence parking above the business uses, we benchmarked the minimum, again these are minimums, at 1 parking space for each residential unit. The developer can provide more, but that is the minimum requirement. There are options for flexibility in the parking, and those include off-site parking, which would have to be accompanied with a parking agreement for that off-site location, but that would be a means to supplement the on-site parking with more remote parking if agreement is in place. And then also looking at shared parking reductions, either for uses that have complementary peak times for parking, so parking, a use, for example, that might have a peak time on the weekend versus a weekday, or a daytime versus evening. They could share parking spaces in circumstances that would all be subject to the planning board review. And then other parking reductions that might come along with other multimodal options that are built into the development of the project, such as zip car spaces, for example, or increased bicycle parking or amenities, having some sort of shuttle where applicable in certain circumstances, or other ways to reduce auto dependence in a project. Bicycle parking is a requirement of the projects as well. And we're almost through. Thank you for your patience as I go through all these details. We're almost through this. The application requirements mirror those of the other sections of the Milton zoning bylaw. Basically, there's a set of plan requirements that go along with the site plan review. Those are built in here. There's the branching of the review based upon that 1940 benchmark of the existing buildings, and that includes going a referral to Milton Historical Commission, and also an additional historical narrative about how that will be integrated into the project. There's a requirement for professional studies calculating the impact of development on town services, on parking, on traffic, and if an adverse impact is identified in those studies, they would have mitigating strategies and or contributions to the town and or surrounding districts to mitigate those impacts. An additional narrative describing parking and transportation infrastructure and any potential off-site transportation impacts as well. And a narrative describing compliance with the design standards, which I've just outlined. And then additional architectural renderings, building elevations, or other survey elements, which are a feature of, in addition to the site plan requirements. And then on top of all that, it's within the planning board's right, and this is documented within the bylaw itself. If assistance from an outside consultant is required for peer review, that peer review option would be paid into by the development team, and then the town would have the ability to use those funds to hire a peer review consultant to assist in the review of a project. So I will pause there before going into the proposed design guidelines. I know that was a lot of detail on the zoning language itself, and answer any questions or take any comments you all have about that.
You had mentioned that the lot is only 3 stories.
Yeah.
But Scott Pony building project over there, that's more than 3.
Yeah, the question was that the zoning we're proposing is only 3 stories, but the Falcone project is more than 3 stories. And that is in fact true. I think it's 4 stories.
I know what you said, there was no anything about the 3 stories.
Correct. So that's it's a reasonable clarification that you're seeking. So what we're talking about is zoning requirements that would apply to future projects. Those projects have already been approved or still in contention. Falcone's a 40B. Yeah, I knew the context of 40B. I just wasn't sure if it was still in litigation. No. Okay, it's breaking ground. Got it. So those projects. So the zoning of the town provides opportunities for development under the rules of the town. As long as the town does not have 10% of its housing stock as affordable housing units, the town is subject to a developer providing approvals through a comprehensive planning permit process, which is a purposeful end around of the town's local regulations, which has been provided by the state since the 60s. So that is the mechanism by which the Falcone project, for example, was permitted. That avenue would still exist in the future. This doesn't stop that. The hope is that by providing a more viable pathway, which we think this zoning does than what the current zoning, compared to the current zoning, that there will be consideration to use this approach, which is a much more straightforward approval process than to use a 40B approach, which would not be subject to a 3-story height limit. There's nothing we can do about that, really. So hopefully that helped clarify. I know it's a long-winded answer.
Could I just ask the planning board, because I've heard so many different stories, just from my understanding. Jim, what is it? Is it 5 stories or 6 stories, the monstrosity that's going up across the street?
I thought it was 5.
Wait,
But the
no,
5th story is
440?
setback.
440?
No,
Falcone.
or
The other ones.
Falcone.
Falcone I thought was 5.
Is
The
it?
5th story is setback.
I've heard both, so, okay.
5 or 6, you said?
Plus we can.
Is it 6?
Plus we can.
So yeah, so it could be more, could be 6.
Just curious, sorry, I know that wasn't
No, that's
relevant.
fine.
My fault, but you answered the question was gonna be, does this mitigate any of the leverage that 40Bs developers have using the 40B, but it really doesn't, right?
I think we're hopeful that the approach is basically to try to capture development interest and excitement in a different way through this zoning. But it does not, if a developer does really see more opportunity in the 40B pathway, this does not stop them from doing that.
No, I mean, this plan looks really, I mean, I'm not a zoning expert by any means, but it looks, just from a layman's term, it looks well thought out, you know, nice job as far as I can see.
Appreciate it.
I have a question on the zoning guidelines. How do the requirements for 50% of commercial use on the ground floor and the zoning requirements for 1 parking spot per residential unit compare to other towns around and attractive developments?
Yeah, I think they are potentially on the conservative side. They're not necessarily
Meaning not much commercial and not enough parking?
meaning a generous amount of parking and a generous amount of commercial.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
conservative.
yeah, so conservative in the in that they may present still an impediment to encouraging development. We've seen that particular type of ground floor requirement is not unusual, but I would say varies from not placing a percentage on it, just having a general requirement, down to like a third of the ground floor. I don't think there's many that are higher than 50%. Well, I say that as a percentage. There are some, I think, that do require the entirety of the ground floor to be non-residential, except for circulation. We've pretty well established that those are almost a non-starter for developers, that the difficulty, and this might be too much detail, but some of you might find it interesting. In these types of projects, generally what we have observed is that the residential uses are the revenue generating uses, and that they are carrying the non-residential uses, that they're subsidizing the non-residential space. Both because on a square foot basis, residential is a higher rate, and sometimes, might be less of a case here, I think it's a vibrant, East Milton Square is vibrant. Oftentimes when a ground floor commercial space is required in a mixed-use project, a developer can have trouble filling that space. So it remains vacant, and then we'll pull on the financials of the project. Yes, sir.
I just want to thank the planning board, you, Josh, and the town staff for listening. I am very happy with where this has progressed from where we were back in 2019. The 3 stories, I think, is a good compromise. It's a half a story greater than what was in the MBTA Communities Act, which limited the area to 2.5. So I think that's a win for everybody. My question really goes around the zoning map. And at town meeting recently, we had an issue with, I think, the overlay district in Lower Mills, where the zoning map, not that map, the one before that. That one right there. I don't really see that presented in the guidelines anywhere. And the only thing that concerns me is that it talks about looking forward. And looking forward really comes from the Barrett report. And if you look at all of the stuff that went back in the past, when we talk about looking forward, there's a lot of references to the Barrett report. And the pink large areas, I kind of understand, but the little pink lines that outline over on, I think it's Mechanic Street and on Edge Hill Road there, I don't see how that translates into all of the other information that's been presented. And it seems to me that it's some sort of a miss, and that those pink lines shouldn't be on the map.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. So just to repeat a little bit of the question for the audience at home, it's about the map and the sort of artifacts on the map that are part of the previous planning studies, and that they're not consistent with maybe the current thinking. And I think that is true. I think this is a diagram we used throughout the process, so it does have many of those references to previous planning studies. And I think that's a part of what's confusing about it. I would actually, so we are not considering any of those additional areas, if I could get my cursor on them. So like these additional areas, oh geez, sorry. These additional areas, or these additional areas, which were a part of the considerations in a larger geography from the previous planning areas. And I think there were valid considerations in terms of in that planning study was looking at sub-districts and other ideas that have not made their way into the current zoning recommendations. We have a much more, I think, straightforward and simplified approach, which focuses on this core area. But that's why in my comments I suggested that this was a little bit confusing map. And this is, I think, much more straightforward and actually a better reflection of the approach, that there is no, this is the district that's proposed. There's no like gray area in between or anything or other considerations. That this would be the overlay district boundary. And if, again, as I mentioned in the comments as I was going through the presentation, if it's successful, I think the areas that you see in that previous map are potentially areas that, not all, but some of the parcels might be areas that are considered for a future expansion. But I think that is probably getting ahead of ourselves a little bit in terms of that's, I think if this district is successful, is a reasonable question.
Yeah, I just want to make sure before it goes to town meeting, which I think is going to happen in May, that the zoning map, and I don't know if that's for you or the planning board or how that works, represents what's in the guidelines, and that it looks the same. Because I know I've done development work around a lot of places, and there's some ambiguity sometimes with stuff like this. And today people understand it, 20 years from now people won't.
Appreciate that. Yeah, we'll include this more straightforward diagram to be clear about where the boundaries are.
Thank you.
Yes.
Could you go back to the parking slide? I just didn't understand something on it. Resident parking fee should be minimum of one parking space per residential unit. Off-site parking be provided to fulfill parking requirements associated with parking agreements. So what does that mean? If there's like 20 units, there's gotta be 20 parking spaces, but what if there's 30 cars? What happens to the other 10 cars?
Yeah, so I think the off-site intention there is, what we've observed is that there are some nearby parking lots, for example, that are outside of the zoning district boundaries. Now, I don't want to call out any individual property owners, but like, for example, a church parking lot, just as a hypothetical, where they might have additional capacity on every day except for Sunday morning. And so the developer could approach them and say, you know, I have a need for 5 extra parking spaces that I can't fit on my site. And so could we actually come to a legal agreement around the use of parking spaces on your property that would be dedicated to my property? And so if an applicant could bring forward such an agreement to the planning board for their review and it checks out, then that would be an option for them to fulfill their parking requirements. So it would be parking that's devoted to their property, but it would not be on their property. It would be off-site.
And that would be a requirement.
It's not a requirement, it's an option.
Or the other option would be they could just park on the street with an extra 10 cars or whatever, right?
No, parking on the street wouldn't be, that's not what the intention is here, because you need an agreement with wherever the sort of recipient parking is. And I don't think that the town is the entity regulating on-street parking, and they would not be providing that parking agreement.
Sorry, kind of to dig in that a little bit, because parking is an issue. There's a minimum of 1 parking space for each residential unit. Is there any guideline that the units are aligned with one parking space? Meaning they're not 4 bedrooms?
We do not regulate bedroom size in any way. So that would be left to the development financials, effectively, what they want the unit mix to be in a development. And that is, I think that's pretty standard practice in zoning these days.
Josh,
Yes,
this isn't the maximum either.
correct.
So a developer could propose more parking than this minimum.
That's correct. This is a requirement to provide a baseline of parking supply for a project.
Right.
Um,
And
and
if
if
they're building bigger units, there'll be overflow on the streets.
I think if they're, usually what we've observed is that if a developer is building larger units and want to sell or rent those larger units and sort of have a certain niche within the market that they're trying to hit, that they are pretty clear about the parking requirements their patrons might expect. And so that they would try to build those into the project. I'm not saying, what I'm saying is that a developer also has interest in wanting to see their project properly parked. And they're not going to be able to rent or sell units if they have to say that, well, you know, you're gonna have to fend for yourself and figure out where you're gonna park. It's not, they just can't lease or sell units that way.
That's what it is now, right? I mean, if you have, 20 2-bedroom units, I would assume that's somewhere between 35 and 40 cars, but you're only requiring 20 parking spaces, is that correct?
Requiring, correct.
Yeah, in that scenario. So, 440 Granite Ave had a similar situation, and well, we do know they go on the street, so that's, you know, I understand what you're trying to do here, that's the balance we're dealing with in this neighborhood. It's just overbuilt already, too many cars already, commercial is going up, and then we're getting two substantial buildings coming in that it's gonna effectively create some chaos. So, I don't know, you know, if there was any way it could be 1.5, I think that may be a more reasonable ask. You know, I mean, I know what you're saying. If someone's gonna buy a two-bedroom, they have two cars, they're gonna look for a two-car solution. But their solution may be, well, we'll park one here, we'll park one on the street. And you can park on the street at night, you know, you're not supposed to, but a lot of people do. It's one of the most unenforced regulations in town. So, you know, again, things look good on paper, but then in actuality, they can cause some issues, unfortunately, or in this case, fortunately.
Yeah, I appreciate that conversation, and what I would add into it is opportunities outside of single sort of car ownership as a solution for cars in these types of districts. I think one of the things districts such as East Milton Square have to get to, and this is, I say these things as a planner all the time, and everyone's just like, whatever, get out of here. But I think walkable districts such as East Milton Square will find their future relevance in the fact that they are different than other suburban places. So that's how they're going to see future investment. And I think as you see more and more use and density in this type of place, you will see people necessarily shift away from having like two cars in a household. And so you'll see, what I would fully expect is that things like Zipcar would become more prominent and prevalent to fill that gap. There are other neighborhoods in the region that work very well with higher levels of zero-car households. And so I feel like those types of things do happen. I understand that there are some potential limitations in East Milton Square in terms of that type of thinking and evolution. But I do think the households that choose to live in these contexts may be different than households that might choose a single-family home somewhere else in Milton. So there's a little bit of self-selection that occurs that might help in this situation.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Possibly we have a little bit more mass transit, but that's also not in this town. So, I mean, I'd love to see that happen. It's like an old Disney World commercial, and you know, we got rails going over the top of us. But you know, I think it'll be a while before that evolution happens. So
I think the fear, maybe Andy's point a little bit, or some of the fears, none of us know what it's going to look like over there when the Falcone thing goes in, the Granite Ave goes in, and I just heard scuttlebutt that it's Quincy, but right on the line is across from the Common Market, there's maybe another development going in. So we don't know. Right now in the current situation, this, I would, could go with that, but we don't know what it's going to look like, because that Falcone project, they BS the whole parking thing. I went to multiple meetings about that at the beginning of it. And, we got to figure it out. Oh, how? They just believe us. I mean, that's basically the answer they gave us. So we don't know what's going to happen when that Falcone. I think that just might be a little bit where some of the fear lies in that. But right now it is. I would go with you on that. Like, my wife's car is about to die. I live in East Milton. I'm like, maybe we can get by with one car, because I can walk the fruity and everything. But we don't know what's going to happen when the 6th story or whatever it is goes up. So anyway, that's something to consider maybe.
Thanks for all your work. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of these pocket parks and more of these outdoor spaces? We have the park, quote unquote, out here. Could you talk a little bit more about the vision for that in the area?
Yeah. So I think it's really, in the case of these types of properties, what I've been imagining is more the leftover interstitial spaces at the fronts of buildings, at the sides of buildings, the small pockets, alleys, etc. All of those spaces should be used to maximum benefit for the district. So there, of course, is need for things like a place to put, you know, trash for pickup and more utilitarian aspects of the site. But I think many more of those in-between spaces, and particularly as properties see future investment or redevelopment, those could be kind of turned back to the community as amenities, and outdoor seating, outdoor dining, the expansion of the sidewalk to make it wider with some more landscape, those types of things.
I got a question about business parking.
Yeah.
So I'm a retired businessman. If I decide I'm gonna come up and go and operate a business again, am I only gonna get one parking space? Because as I see, the commercial, the building is gonna have 50% commercial on the first floor, but even though it's 50%, if I lease that, am I only gonna get one parking space?
It would depend on the use of the space. So
Wait, what do you mean? If it's an optometry business, or if it's an insurance agency, each are gonna be attracting people. Are you gonna, if the insurance agency is gonna attract a lot more people than the optometrist, will I get more parking spaces?
yeah, so each of those uses, I don't have it in front of me, but each of the commercial uses in the current zoning bylaw are defined with slightly different rates of parking that are required depending on the square footage of that use. So it does vary if it's a, you know, personal service provider versus a dentist versus a restaurant, and there would be variation in the commercial parking
Would there
requirements.
be spaces on the street in front of the building?
These would be requirements for the property to have to figure out how to provide. They would not be,
Would they have to provide one but no more?
not necessarily just one, as many as is required for the amount of space. So if the ratio in the bylaw is for a restaurant, a parking space for every 15 square feet of active restaurant space, and the restaurant space is 1,000 square feet, then you do that calculation that would require. Yes.
I have two quick questions here. On the existing non-residential use exclusions, if I were to have, or someone were to have a building on that, one of those, and sold it, is that usage grandfathered? In other words, if it's a mortuary and, you know, Mr. Dolan decides he's out of business and wants to sell the property, can that building become another mortuary, or B, another non-residential exclusion? Or does it have to fall back?
No, so I think that's, in this case, it's very clear, because what we're creating is a separate overlay district. The rights that those property owners have under the existing zoning still remain. So the uses that are allowed under the current business district still include undertaker, gas station, car repair, et cetera, et cetera.
So that parcel of land can always be an undertaker or a gas station or whatever?
Yeah, it would be up to the property owner.
Okay, and then, is there any avenue, to which, let's say I wanted to build a building and I wanted to go 11 feet on the first floor, not 12, right? Do you just say, nah, sorry, you gotta go 12, or is there an appeal process? Can I come for a variance on that? How does that?
Yeah, I think it would be through a variant, they'd request a variance on that requirement for the minimum ground floor height.
So as a developer, you could look at these requirements and say, there's a little bit of wiggle room here.
I think, yeah, they could propose it. It's fully within the planning board's right, if a variance is proposed, to not grant that variance in this case.
But you can ask, so you could go through the process.
Yeah, you could, that process exists, I think, for any zoning district.
Okay, thank you.
I spent a lot of time with the survey data after you conducted the 2 surveys, and I feel like this plan really represents overwhelmingly the majority of feedback that you guys got, and I'm very excited for this. You know, we've got the limited 3 stories. You've really done a lot to make sure that businesses make it a walkable area, you know, the 12-foot windows, no overhang on the sidewalks. Like, there's a lot in this to make this, help us make decent East Milton vibrant without, while deterring the 40B project. So thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you. All right, so we're ready to look at the design guidelines, just to give you a little bit more information about how this comes together as a package. And we can take some more questions after that as well. So, as a separate package, so it's not a part of the actual town bylaw, there's a design guidelines document, and that design guidelines document has not yet been, I don't believe, but will be adopted as an instrument of the planning board effectively, and that's how those work. And so this is a separate package. It provides more detail, I think, around what is intended by the zoning in East Milton Square, by the overlay district, and provides more guidance, as the name suggests. These are not requirements, though, so as opposed to the standards which are in the bylaw, which I would say place the town with the advantage in terms of making sure that those are part of a project. These are advisory in nature, and while they provide, I think, the talking points for a detailed review in these, I would, just to be honest about it all, I think under a site plan review process, which is what we're proposing, the developer would have, but ultimately the upper hand to say no if they didn't ultimately want to do one of these things. Nonetheless, it is a good context for a project and sets the ambition for the quality of a project that we want to see. The design guidelines document does include, in addition to, you can see in the contents here, which is a little bit small on the screen, there's an introductory section which includes a discussion about the applicability of the guidelines, the intent of them, how they're organized, the process by which they would be integrated into a development review process with the planning board, and then a reflection back to the standards, which are the requirements that we've gone through in the bylaw language. Then there's a section which we think is helpful to set the stage for an applicant coming into the town of Milton who may not be as familiar with East Milton Square and the surrounding neighborhoods. And it really gives a brief history, some of the architectural styles, and some of the other design qualities of the area, hopefully to give their design team a crash course on what's important here. And then the remainder of the document is focused on the design guidelines, and those are arrayed across a number of topics, from building design through the site design and landscaping, all the way through to signage, lighting, and sustainability. So here's a little bit of a window into the history and context section. So it goes through some of those critical properties, the Adams building, the post office, this structure that we're having a meeting in this evening, the Milton Arts Center, and some of the facts and figures about their characteristics. And just a note too, so each of these structures are a part of the overlay district. If a applicant in the future, I think some of these are under non-private control, of course, so there'd have to be some additional process there. But these are all properties which fall before that 1940 date. So these would all be properties that are subject to that additional review and additional historic preservation requirements. And then you can see the document itself has both topical language that provides more detail around these topics, and then also some illustrations and photographs that we try to cater to the type of character, scale, and look and feel of East Milton Square. And these provide, again, something that we're hoping that an applicant's design team would really dig into and try to put their best foot forward in terms of being compatible with East Milton Square. In terms of the building design, the topics that we're covering in the guidelines include how to site a structure on a property, the architectural context for fitting in, the building form, roofs, and expressing a preference for pitched roofs, the facades of a building, the composition and proportions of a building, some guidance around entrances, doors, windows, awnings, canopies, even getting into materials, features such as cupolas and chimneys, and then how service equipment is integrated into the design. Here's another page from the public realm section. We talk about streetscape design and contributions of a private project to that streetscape. The potential for improvements to on-street parking through development, materials and how they integrate with the public realm and make consistent the pavers, the ground plane, etc. Adding to street furnishings consistently so that there are more, over time, more benches, more amenities that show up. Accessibility and walls and fences on properties. Vehicular access, we have discussion of how parking should be integrated into the property, driveways and alleys, and the location of parking lots themselves. And then a lot about landscaping and really building up the landscape character of the district to have a vibrant and green district so that it is really the center and heart of a residential neighborhood, and you feel that even as you walk through the business district. So that includes plant materials, streetscape, parking landscape, site landscaping, and buffers to non-district properties, so budding residential neighborhoods or residential neighbors. And then we get into lighting and trying to create a consistent character for lighting throughout the district, both in terms of streetscape lighting, but building and site lighting, thinking about the lighting intensity and the control of glare, particularly as it relates to surrounding residential properties, the types of lamps and fixtures and the hours of operation, trying again to provide guardrails and guidance around those impacts and potential impacts to neighbors, thinking about having a vibrant and consistent language of signage in the district, which points a lot to, you know it as you visit walkable districts as tourists or visitors to other places, that it's often signage that sets the tone for a district. So we're put some guidance around that in terms of the quantity and size of signs, designing materials, we provided some images, placement of signs on facades and the importance of how they're organized together, and then how they relate to awnings, canopies, and marquees. And then have a section about sustainability guidance where we talk about the building itself, but also stormwater management on the property, low impact development, streetscape sustainability, and trying to, with each of these investments, point to a more climate friendly and sustainable future for the district and for the town. So that gives you a window into this document. I think it's in the neighborhood of 40 pages or so of more detailed language within each of those topics, and you're invited to grab a copy and flip through, but this is all in the name of really trying to get an applicant's project to match your vision and ambition for the district, and we think this is a helpful tool to do so. Additional questions or thoughts?
And you mentioned that, the stormwater stuff. What about we're gonna have problems with rodents? Is there anything there for us that's gonna help us with that problem? I don't see them taking care of situations like that, because I heard there's rats already over at the new project on Granite Ave. I don't want them in my yard, that's for sure.
Yeah, questions about rodents and language about rodents. I don't think any of our language so far includes rodents specifically. There might be another part of the town's bylaws, Board of Health, perhaps.
Josh, I think it would be helpful to explain to the audience that this does not replace any of what exists in the town to protect the residents for the concerns, some of the concerns that have been raised. There are mechanisms to address what the speaker just mentioned. There is a mechanism already to address what the gentleman behind me had concern for parking. One parking space per unit is only for the residential units. The business parking requirements are in place already. The business has to meet those business parking requirements. So the structure of the town with respect to so many of the topics that are being talked about, there are protective measures that already exist. This is not replacing them. This is really complementing, right, what we already have. So
Just to reiterate the point into the microphones to make sure it's heard, that the protections that the town has in other parts of the bylaw and regulations are not being replaced in any manner by this overlay. The overlay is adding the new opportunity, which is pretty well defined, as I've shared, for mixed-use development, but that would be subject to all of the additional language that's put forward in the town's bylaws and regulations. This does not provide any special exception or ability to avoid any of those other requirements. So Board of Health requirements around rodents or other things, or other business parking requirements, those we in some cases refer directly to some of those other sections, and in other cases those other sections would remain in full force and effect.
The town's affordability requirement is 10%. You have in here 12% up to 25 units, and then 15%. So it's greater than the town's required. How did you come up with that number, and why is 25 the inflection point for increasing it?
Yeah, it's a number which we think is beneficial for a number of reasons. The first of which is that it helps the town not just keep pace with the requirements of 10% affordability, but actually make a progress on it. So that would be the reason for the percentage increases. In terms of the scaling inflection point, and again, this is on affordability, just to frame for people who may not have heard the question. We find that smaller projects and the financials of smaller projects have more difficulty incorporating and carrying the subsidies of the affordable units. So as you move to a larger scale of housing development, there's more ability to carry that 15%. So that's the 25%, or I mean the 25 unit inflection point is about where that difference occurs. It's an area where you might see, I don't know, you can imagine a project which is almost at that tipping point or maybe just over it, and that might be another variance that could be sought, that they say, you know, we can make the 12% work with 15% with our 26 unit project is tough or something like that. But so it's not a perfect science, but that's about where that break point is. Yes, sir.
On the map, you currently have the fruit center marketplace converted over from residential split to all commercial, correct? Is that what I'm seeing? Seeing there?
Yeah, the overlay.
Yeah, the overlay.
Yeah.
Really, I have some concerns about that. You know, I think there's 23 to 26 houses that actually abut that building, which I believe the entire building is in the residential zone in the split. The parcel is wrapped by those homes, and they're already undergoing a lot of stress from the expansions that are happening in town, and I would hate to see the loss of control of that building. And you know, they always seem to have expansion on their docket. Right now they have the controversial restaurant expansion going on. Previously they wanted to put a second floor on and ran into some engineering issues that can be solved with money. Yeah, I don't know. I just don't have a good feeling about that. I would rather have that stay in the residential area, in the residential zone. I mean, right now it's family owned, but the proprietor is coming up on, you know, retirement age. And what if he sells it? And what if someone proposes a tear down in a bigger structure? Or, you know, it would change the entire complexity of that neighborhood and affect that direct neighborhood as well as the whole town. If we took away that store. Yeah, did you give any thought to that, or?
Yeah, I think that we are not changing the way that property is currently regulated. We are providing the opportunity for mixed-use development as we are for the other properties. So it would only be under the context of a mixed-use redevelopment that the property owner, whoever it may be, would be exercising this new zoning, the zoning overlay. So I just want to set aside the fear that the zoning overlay will somehow introduce some change, unintended consequence in how the fruit center is currently administered. And I'm not exactly clear, not like you all know better than I do how that is currently happening. But, so it being a split zone parcel today, my guess is that probably most of the changes and improvements that are being requested are occurring through a special permit process. That would remain the same. So you would only see that property exercising this overlay if it were a circumstance of the property owner, whoever the property owner may be, the current property owner, future property owner, wanting to redevelop the property as a mixed-use property.
Right, that would allow for some expansion by right, correct, rather than going through a special permit.
Within the confines of these requirements, yeah. So I think, for example,
So they wanted 3 stories in there.
it would be,
A 3-story building with,
it would be 3 stories. I think a complication, I have not,
yeah, we're just talking height.
yeah, I haven't done any sort of detailed thinking on the fruit center, but one of the things that pop out to me is that the setback requirements, the more generous side and rear setback requirements, because they are abutting all residential neighbors, would be more generous. And that probably would require a buildable footprint on the property, which is actually more constrained than where the current buildings are placed, if you understand. Like, I think the current buildings are placed closer to the lot line than the requirements of this.
Right, in the setting, although you could go up.
Well, what I would posit is that that would require a variance under the overlay. And so then the planning board could say no. Because the requirements in the zoning are pretty clear about where the setback would occur. So if they were redeveloping the property as a mixed-use redevelopment, they would have to comply with all the features that I presented earlier, which would include the setbacks. So in that circumstance, it would not be the structure that exists that would be built. It would be a new,
Exactly.
the site would be cleared and it would be a new structure.
That's right.
Was there any thought in the overlay planning about what the impact would be on public safety services? What's this density and more residents living high?
Yeah, I think in general, and we have not done those specific analyses in this work, in general, those types of municipal service analyses show that these are net positive developments for a town's bottom line. I think the town's own 3A analysis showed that as well at that scale. For the scale that was contemplated for the 3A projects, that analysis was performed. In this circumstance, one of the ways that it's addressed more specifically through the zoning is the requirement for an analysis of the impacts and mitigation of those impacts. So on a project-by-project basis, a proponent would be doing their own analysis of the impact on municipal services, on fire and safety, on other schools, etc. And if a detrimental impact were identified, then they would be making some sort of amends to that impact. In general, what we have seen in these analyses is that they'll probably come back with a net positive to the town, which has been observed to be true.
Okay, thank you.
You have no idea how many people you might get, residents living there or extra people, right? In this area, you have no estimates on that?
No, it's very difficult to, as a professional working in this field, I think my fear is more that this won't change anything on the ground than it will create a runaway redevelopment scenario. So I think that it's more likely that you might have a single property, or maybe two properties if we're lucky, convert under this proposed zoning over the coming 5 or 10 years. That I would consider that probably a success. I don't think it's the case that we would expect, like you'll never see 100% turnover of properties in a district based upon a zoning change. That's just not anticipated, nor has really much happened. So no, we don't provide estimates of the actual residents. It's very hard to predict because of the individual property circumstances on each of these, exactly which ones would actually redevelop. And so therefore, making projections about actual impacts on number of people or number of cars is a guess on top of a guess on top of a guess.
So, my second part of the question, if somebody developed it into mixed use, 3 stories, whatever they could do, put in as many apartments in there as possible, and you needed new water sewer system, need to be upgraded in the town. Who pays for that?
Yeah, the towns are under no obligation to provide the infrastructure to support a
The
development.
developer.
So probably not, like I don't think it would be affordable at the scale of development that would probably be occurring within this overlay district, that they would be able to support that type of infrastructure investment. Potentially, multiple property owners and developers within a district such as this could come together and form some sort of agreement where they support additional wastewater infrastructure investments or something like that to unlock the development capability and development potential. But it's not, under any circumstance, the town is not obligated to provide that, whatever.
Not the town.
I'll just add that there are circumstances where a town would want to provide that infrastructure to incentivize redevelopment. I mean, that's not unheard of. And so I'm not sure that the towns, in this circumstance, that applies, but just to say, like, towns investing in infrastructure is not a bad thing. And it happens. All right, so I will just summarize some quick next steps, and I appreciate you all through sometimes what can be a very detailed and overly language-based subject. So everything that we've just gone through this evening has been voted by the planning board to place on the annual town meeting warrant. So that will be one of the zoning, or one of the articles which is on the warrant, and it will be the proposed zoning for the East Milton Square mixed-use overlay. At this point, particularly given the discussion we've had this evening, I would encourage you, and I'm sure the planning board would as well, to encourage town meeting members to vote to support this community-based zoning recommendation. I do think we've landed in a place where we have been responsive to, and that feeling that we had has been confirmed, I believe, this evening. And so hopefully there is support for this project, and I think it will provide an avenue for future development in East Milton Square that I think we could all be pleased and proud of. So appreciate your time and all your the hours that everyone has put into this process and effort, and we'll continue to be available to the planning board as needed to support this as it moves forward. Thank you all very much.
I just wanted to say thank you to Josh, because he's really guided the planning board through this process, and I think he really, we are approaching this in a way that we have really wanted to listen to the residents in East Milton, and your feedback has been critical. The residents who are here tonight and who have attended the other forums, it's been great to have this collaboration, and with Josh's leadership. Thank you.